So Michael Tracey, thanks for meeting with me. We're both here at a Tulsi Gabbard, Jimmy Dore drug legalization event here in New Hampshire. What did you think of the event?
You know, I thought it was very good. I thought that she has, I'm messing up my tenses now, but I think that one reason why this event was, bye Jimmy. Just had to say goodbye to Jimmy as he was walking out. One reason why I think that they did this event was because she has a unique perspective on drug prohibition writ large. So I was actually at her event 2 or 3 weeks ago now in Meredith, New Hampshire, where she made a statement on drug prohibition that I personally hadn't heard her say before, and I thought it merited wider attention, and so I finagled such that it ended up being written up in Forbes. But basically she was saying that we need a system where prohibition is abolished to really address the systemic maladies that are wrought by this drug prohibition regimen. So you can't just tinker around the edges. I mean, it's good to legalize marijuana, and that was largely what this event was about. But if you notice, what she said at the end was about looking to the Portugal model, where it's not just assumed that anybody who possesses an illicit substance is going to be subject to arrest. That's not how it works.
Right.
And at this event in Meredith a couple of weeks ago, somebody asked her, do you think that it's an extreme solution to say that maybe we should think about legalizing all drugs? She said, no, that's not extreme. Legalize and regulate. So regulate is a key word there, because people are going to scaremonger and say if you call for legalization, that means you're advocating for a heroin store on every street corner, which is not the case. It means that you're removing drug policy from the domain of criminal law, which means that law enforcement are not going to be the ones that are going to be, for example, attending to a sick person who's undergoing addiction or has some kind of issue. Rather, it's going to be civil forces or civil personnel or health professionals. You have to rethink the fundamental underpinnings of the entire prohibition regimen in order, I think, to really address some of these problems. And she recognizes that, and she's a rarity in the field in expressing that recognition. And it also gets back to, I think, what was a basic theme of her campaign, which is she's always sort of wanting not to simply deal with the surface level issues. She always seems to want to go to the root cause. And this is just another example, so I thought the event was good.
So you've been following Tulsi since the beginning. We actually interviewed her back-to-back in March. I think it was like the day that the Barr announced his summary of the investigation.
It was a big day.
Yeah, so I mean, you've been following her for since the beginning, I believe. How would you assess how her candidacy, how her campaign has changed over the last year?
Well, I've not just been following her since the beginning of the campaign. I've been following her for years before she even ran for president. So the first time I interviewed her was in 2017, shortly after she returned from the Syria trip, which now everybody pretty much knows who follows her. She took with Dennis Kucinich to.
Right. Well, what's funny is they don't often mention that Kucinich was there. It's they just say she went. Like she went on her own. Like
she's this rogue actor or something, and nobody would ever dare accompany her on such a trip, right? Yeah, but Dennis Kucinich is the one who helped facilitate that, which I think is pretty notable and significant context to remind people of when they just try to use that as a wedge or a way to attack or malign her. So that was the first time I followed her prior to 2017 even, but 2017 was the first time I interviewed her. But obviously my attention escalated when she began running for president. And I went to some of those very early events around the time where I guess I encountered you. And one thing that I noticed as the campaign has progressed is I do feel that she's gotten a lot sharper, a lot more incisive, more cogent in her arguments, more, I think, penetrating in her insights. And if that sounds sycophantic, so be it. It's just my honest observation. I feel like she's more able to sort of weave together coherent narratives that are singularly her own in terms of her critiques of foreign policy, yes, but also how foreign policy intersects with domestic policy, which is basically what her campaign is about. It's about sort of raising the consciousness of the people so they don't just bifurcate foreign policy and domestic policy as these separate domains, but they think of them as wrapped together. Because it's true, if you're making massive expenditures overseas on totally unnecessary and destructive wars, there's a trade-off there. There's an opportunity cost. That money could be used on domestic expenditures, and yet we're told over and over again that we don't have money for basic services.
Right.
And so I think the way that she frames that has gotten a lot more resonance. I even experienced firsthand. There was an event a couple days ago, maybe a week ago, in Meredith. Sorry, the event where she gave the drug legalization comment was Merrimack.
Gotcha.
The one I'm going to refer to now was in Meredith.
Okay.
And I talked to a woman who was sort of a casual politics consumer, as many voters are, had not even heard of Tulsi until that very day when she was at work at a local hospital, and her coworkers were mentioning Tulsi and saying, "Oh yeah, we saw some flyers. She's going to be here at the local, restaurant bar type venue." And she said, "Oh, okay, maybe I'll go." And she goes home. She sees a flyer at her door reminding her that the event's taking place, and she realizes that the event was taking place literally next door to her house. It's only in New Hampshire people get that kind of opportunity where there just happens to be a presidential candidate having an event literally right next door to where they live.
Right.
So she shows up. She listens to Tulsi. And I talked to the woman else afterwards, and she says, "Yeah, I'm going to vote for Tulsi now. I just heard about her for the first time today." I asked her to explain why, and she said that, she connects foreign policy to what I'm most concerned about, which is healthcare,
Right.
in a way that I find intelligible, in a way that hadn't been put to me that way before. And I think that really is one of the main accomplishments so far of Tulsi's campaign, in that she's causing people to sort of reorient how they frame politics in their minds. Even a lot of the libertarians I talked to, there are a healthy share of libertarians at this event tonight. Some of her volunteers are libertarians. Libertarians, you'll find if you go around and sort of survey voters, tend to have a very positive opinion of her. And initially, when you think about that, you say to yourself, how do these libertarians reconcile their support for Tulsi with her advocacy of domestic policy prescriptions like a form of single-payer healthcare? That would seem to run directly counter to the libertarian outlook on limited or no government. And almost without exception, one thing they tell me is that they agree with her as a matter of emphasis. So they agree with her in making a fundamental reevaluation and revamping of U.S. foreign policy her top priority. And so that is what they also prioritize, and therefore philosophical disagreements over the propriety of a government-administered healthcare program aren't as significant to them. And even in some cases, they tell me that the way that she sort of characterizes the broad scope of these issues has caused them to rethink their opposition to stuff like single-payer healthcare, because they say to themselves, okay, if we're spending trillions of dollars overseas and the government's going to be spending the money anyway, does it make sense to spend it on something that's socially beneficial, that actually improves people's lives? So her unique way of sort of casting these issues has caused people to reassess some of the presuppositions that underlie their political thinking. And I don't think you can say that for many other candidates.
No, probably no other candidate. Yeah. I mean, that's the thing about her, is she seems to be politically transcendent in the fact that, there are democratic socialists who support her, there are conservatives who support her, there are libertarians, I'm sure there are centrists, there's all kinds of different varieties of people from across the political spectrum who seem to support her. Do you think it's really just foreign policy, or do you think that there's other aspects of her and her story that is drawing those different groups together?
There are other aspects of it, but it's interesting. You sort of mentioned this heterodox coterie of supporters that she has, and it's true. I mean, I see it at every event. You have Trump supporters who say that she's the only Democrat they could ever consider voting for.
Yep, you hear all the time, why is she a Democrat, is what they'll say.
Yeah, well, I mean, even some of her detractors in the more like establishment liberal realm, they'll say, she's a Republican. And I say to them, okay, can you name me a Republican who supports single-payer health care, who denounces the Israeli occupation of Palestine in pretty dramatically stark terms, actually? She's gotten more vehement about that as the campaign has progressed. That's one element of progression that I've noted. She supports prohibition on fossil fuels. She supports all manner of domestic policy proposals that are pretty traditionally associated with the progressive left. Removing sanctions on Iran, ending drug prohibition, the list goes on. So I ask those people, I don't know any Republican who supports the totality of those positions on top of calls for the defeat of Trump every day. Like, name me a Republican who's calling for the defeat of Trump and has those positions. They don't exist.
Right.
So if you're calling a Republican, you're just being either intentionally obfuscatory or you're being lazy. You're doing something in an effort to just dismiss her out of hand because you can't really contend with what she's actually saying. One thing about this unusual confluence of her supporters that's notable is when the media does cover her, and I mean sort of the mainstream establishment media, when they do cover her and they talk about the nature of her support base, they'll often try to portray it as somehow sinister or nefarious, that you do have this diverse collection of people from differing ideological perspectives supporting her. They'll say there's something evil about that. There's something that reflects why she's this imposter who's dangerous. But you could easily, at least from my standpoint, put a much different spin on it and say it's actually reflective of a kind of political breakthrough.
Right.
That people could unite, in a sense, behind a mutual affinity for this candidate, and yet the media, in large part, doesn't have the vocabulary to talk about what is unique about her appeal. And so they always resort to denigration or delegitimization because it just doesn't register with them how somebody could support her on the grounds of, for example, prioritizing foreign policy or just liking aspects of her temperamental style. You mentioned, is it just foreign policy? No, it's not. I think she also generates support because she seems to float above, or she transcends a lot of the culture war theatrics that have characterized the dominant means by which Trump has been opposed since he took office. So Tulsi famously met with Trump after he was elected. She went to Trump Tower. They talked about foreign policy in Syria in particular. And people thought, oh my God, you're giving credence to Trump. Well, first of all, he's the elected president, so you would want somebody at least attempting to exert some positive influence on him. And now she's one of his staunchest critics because Trump did not take her advice. He filled his administration with neocons and warhawks like John Bolton, Mike Pompeo, the list goes on.
Which has worked out really well for him.
Right. But in meeting with Trump at that point, in demonstrating that she was at least willing to have a good faith exchange with Trump, now she has standing to criticize him, and she can't be accused of just being this knee-jerk anti-Trump partisan. Unlike most other Democrats who never would have even dreamed of going to Trump Tower and having at least attempted to have a fruitful exchange with the guy.
Right.
And so that says something about her basic approach to politics and to just political debate writ large, that I think a lot of people, whether it's Republicans, conservatives, moderates, there actually are some liberals who support her. I mean, you never know it when you watch the media, but I find a species of Tulsi supporter at her events who's just sort of a generic Democrat, have been their entire lives, and they get firsthand exposure to her, and they say to themselves, you know what, I actually think she's uniquely suited to take on Trump. I actually think she would have a very good chance of defeating Trump. She just seems to have a personality and a set and a political persona that would contrast very favorably with Trump. So those people do exist. And you have heterodox leftists and progressives who back her. That's an interesting coalition. It actually speaks to how that coalition could potentially broaden in the context of a general election and expand the electorate were she to theoretically be the nominee. And so I think people like that she doesn't indulge in these cheap anti-Trump histrionics. Her criticisms of Trump are targeted and substantive and therefore more effective than your standard fare Democrat who's just willing to say that the latest thing that Trump tweeted is like the end of the world and democracy is going to crumble. Like, she doesn't really resort to that kind of cheap rhetoric. And so people like that. She doesn't engage in the superficial identity mongering that you often see among your standard Democrats either. And so if her entire mode of political being is divergent with the prevailing modes of political being, at least as you see them expressed by mostly Democrats, that's going to attract a lot of people's interest. And it's going to make them say, oh, maybe there is sort of a different model available to us here that she embodies.
You can also see why the media would be so threatened by that, right? Because we have such a professional wrestling-ized corporate media where you're either supposed to be a Fox News viewer or MSNBC viewer and think a certain way. And if she's able to break through that paradigm and get people to see that it is all fake and recognize that it's silly that the people who are impeaching Donald Trump are giving him standing ovations the next day at the State of the Union, I think it's a threat to how the corporate media is trying to indoctrinate the public at large.
Yeah, so people try to denounce her for going on Fox News, right? First of all, Fox News invites her on, and other networks don't to the same degree. So of course, if she's trying to reach the maximum number of Americans, she's going to go on Fox News when the invitation is extended.
And she's also the only one who appears on radical left-wing channels as well.
Exactly, and that never gets mentioned.
Right.
Just today, she did the Red Scare podcast,
right.
which is a left-wing podcast, believe me. It's a little bit ideologically heterodox, I'll grant that, but it's a left-wing podcast. They're two semi-socialist, whatever they might self-describe as, I'm not exactly sure, but it's certainly a left-wing podcast, and she appeared on that just today.
Right. Would Joe Biden appear on that podcast?
No, of course not. Would Joe Biden do Primo Nutmeg?
No.
Right. Would Joe Biden do my little YouTube podcast deal? No. So she's done. They try to castigate her for going on Fox News, but they ignore that she's done all this very ideologically diverse independent media, which is why she has a particularly impassioned support base online, because they say, oh, she's willing to speak to these independent arbiters of the way information flows on politics in this country, and that's really refreshing and necessary. And by the way, the stuff that she said on this podcast today, it was a little, but which you can watch on my channel. I'm going to post it on my YouTube channel tomorrow. I don't know when you're going to put this up, but February 2nd, it's going to be up. But this thing, obviously, it's a little bit of different format than when you're on Fox News and you're speaking in 2-minute increments. But the basic thrust of what she was saying on this podcast is the same as what she would say anywhere else. So it's one thing if you could accuse her of pandering, if she modifies what she says when she goes on, for example, Fox News, which, by the way, I get similar criticism because I also occasionally go on Fox News and people say, oh, you're pandering, you're saying what they want you to say, you're advancing this Republican right-wing agenda. I'm saying, no. I would say exactly what I said on Fox News on a left-wing podcast, and have. So you can't accuse me of inconsistency or just trying to placate people when there's no differentiation at all between what I say depending on the venue. It's the same. And I think she has a very similar philosophy. And by the way, when she does go on Fox News, she argues against military intervention. She criticizes Donald Trump.
Right.
She warns against the catastrophic consequences of war with Iran. So,
from my point of view too, that was what was so nefarious about Fox News in the 2000s, right?
Yeah.
Is that they were a Bush administration propaganda outlet talking about how great the war in Iraq was.
Right.
If she's going on that channel and speaking about the detrimental effects of our wars, isn't that a great thing?
That has a far more far-reaching impact than any of the people who screech and complain and pull their hair out of their heads about her going on Fox News. She's doing more to actually produce a politically beneficial outcome by going on Fox News than they are by whinging about it. By far. No comparison there. So, you can complain about going on Fox News all you want, but how about just taking, if you want to criticize her, fine. I have some criticisms of her. But I'm going to criticize her for the things that she says rather than for the venue in which she says them.
So what are your criticisms of her?
I think that at times she can be a little too reliant on the rhetoric of bipartisanship. And I think bipartisanship is fine, but it sort of depends what your paradigm for bipartisan cooperation is. If you want to work in a bipartisan way to reduce military expenditures, right, or shrink the defense budget or not go to war, then yeah, you're going to find some Republicans and even some conservatives who agree with that. So bipartisan cooperation's all fine and dandy. But I don't know that I would necessarily exalt to quite the same degree that she does bipartisanship as a virtue unto itself. It matters what is being produced from that cooperation. And in fairness, I mean, I think she would probably agree with that statement that I just said, but there are times when her rhetoric doesn't quite capture what I think would constitute fruitful bipartisan cooperation, and she kind of just promotes it for its own sake.
Right. So, for example, I remember this past fall when there was outrage about Ellen DeGeneres, sitting next to George W. Bush at a football game, which is kind of funny that there was outrage because he was actually on her show previously, and they'd like danced together and whatnot. But I remember that was something that Tulsi spoke out against and saying that it's a good thing that Ellen DeGeneres is sitting with George W. Bush at a football game. From my perspective, that's kind of missing the fact that it's legitimizing a war criminal, and I think maybe Tulsi didn't really pick up on that.
But think about it this way, right? What was the criticism of Tulsi for meeting Assad? Legitimizing a war criminal. So, I mean, I just think that she, for better or worse, applies that same mindset to anybody, even a George W. Bush, right? So she would probably meet with George W. Bush. And if you don't like that, if you don't want her to meet with Netanyahu, if you don't want her to meet with Assad, if you don't want to meet with Modi, anybody, okay, then she's not your person, because that's just what her instinct is to essentially meet with everybody.
But
and treat them with a fundamental degree of respect.
Would Tulsi go to a football game with Hillary Clinton?
I don't know, probably not. That would be an amusing challenge for her, though. Maybe we should try to set that up.
Okay. So yeah, the first elections are taking place this next couple weeks. So this week is the Iowa caucus.
But let me just clarify something about the bipartisanship thing, because I do think that her notion of bipartisanship does differ from your average Democrat, your average centrist Democrat.
Yeah.
So she's not approaching it from the standpoint of kind of just warmed over centrism, where bipartisanship typically means getting together to cut social welfare spending and drop maybe half as many bombs as the most unrepentant war hawks want to drop. So that's not the compromise she's seeking to make. And so if her lines of demarcation around what kind of compromises are acceptable differ dramatically from what the average centrist does. So her form of bipartisan cooperation is not going to be what Mike Bloomberg's form of bipartisan cooperation is, right?
It's kind of inverted, right?
It's inverted. So that kind of inverted bipartisanship, I think, has value. And so I don't begrudge her for advocating that. I just think that there are times when she's just speaking about bipartisanship or the inescapability of partisan divisions and how we need to get beyond those. It doesn't sort of capture the full scope of what she's really advocating. And so if you're not that familiar with her, if you're not familiar with her as I am, you can, I think, mistake her for advocating a similar type of bipartisanship that, say, like an Amy Klobuchar would back.
So yeah, again, we're coming up on the Iowa caucus and the New Hampshire primaries. Just overall, how do you think that those two will unfold?
Well, I'm not going to make any firm predictions. We'll know soon enough. I think for Tulsi's purposes, obviously the campaign decided months ago that they were going to focus single-mindedly on New Hampshire.
I think, I mean, maybe it's just my perspective because I've seen her in New Hampshire, but it seems like almost from the beginning there was a strong focus here.
There was a strong focus from the beginning, but they also did campaign in Iowa for a little while, and I believe around October they just said, okay, we're diverting our resources nearly exclusively to New Hampshire, because she is not a billionaire. she's not a fundraising behemoth like Bernie.
Right.
So she has to be judicious about how she spends her resources, right? And in Iowa, in order to really be competitive, you have to have a major organization. The caucus is very idiosyncratic in that it relies heavily on the-ground organizing, which requires a lot of money. And I didn't think that she felt it was I don't think she felt it was viable to invest in Iowa and New Hampshire simultaneously, given her resource constraints. So New Hampshire was always, I think, a little bit better suited to her because it's an open primary. Independents can vote in the Democratic primary, and she does disproportionately well with independents. Well, again, as I mentioned before, there are Democrats that support her as well. We're just sort of like lifetime Democrats and don't give it that much thought that they still like her. Because they don't buy into like the Twitter narrative about her or the MSNBC narrative. They make their own independent judgments. I think rather than make any predictions as to the outcome of Iowa or New Hampshire, obviously Bernie's trending upward in the polls, so maybe he sweeps 2 states. That wouldn't shock me. But it is worth, I think, remarking on the total absurdity that on the day of the Iowa caucus, Bernie and the other senators running for president, Warren, Klobuchar, etc., they're going to be physically confined to Washington, D.C. because of this impeachment trial.
Right.
Which is like a crazy scenario that even the most creative writer of fiction involving U.S. politics probably would not have conjured up because they thought it would be too far-fetched. But that's what's come to pass. And it's just amazing that this drive toward impeachment, which began before Trump even took office, is now culminating on the Iowa caucus. There's some really, there's some kind of dark symbolism there that I don't really have the full fluency to articulate right now. But that's amazing to me. And I wouldn't give you too much grief if you do come up with an interesting conspiracy theory to explain why Bernie is being basically physically confined to Washington, D.C. on the day of the Iowa caucus, if there was some intentionality behind that. I don't know if there is. Maybe there probably wasn't. But I wouldn't fault you for having that impression.
It's funny, too, that now that Bernie is supposedly surging, I kind of wondered how much of that is just, inaccurate polling up until people start voting. But now there's really a strong pushback. There's a lot of corporate media talking heads who are, saying that he can't defeat Trump. And there's just a strong pushback on Twitter, especially. Do you think that they may take it a step further, where the DNC is actually, changing the rules to bring back the superdelegates, or that they're, hoping to get to a second round of voting at the convention at least to skew it then?
I really doubt that'll happen, because I think that Bernie has made more inroads with factions of the Democratic establishment than maybe people appreciate. So
he's been trying very hard, that's for sure.
Yes, right? Since 2016, he's made a pretty obvious, conscious effort to bridge the divide between himself, who was viewed in 2016 as something of an imposter, and the power bases of the Democratic Party, such that I think that they're going to, if he, for example, he sweeps the first couple states, I think you're going to see a level of acceptance of Bernie among those people that might have been surprising, amongst those who thought that there would be a total meltdown. Now, are certain people going to melt down? Mainly the money to lead to the party? Yeah. But there are other factions of the party that wield influence as well. It's an unwieldy coalition, right? Mm-hmm. So is there going to be anger initially on the part of sort of like these Clinton acolytes who still comprise much of the institutional apparatus of the Democratic Party's structure? Yeah, sure. But I think that anger is going to give way to acceptance a little bit more quickly than people might understand, because I think Bernie's cultivation of Democratic Party power brokers has been roughly successful. I mean, he did stuff like he appeared at events alongside Andrew Cuomo. He co-wrote op-eds with Chuck Schumer. This is one of my main criticisms of him, but he never challenged any aspect of the RussiaGate narrative.
No, he wholeheartedly embraced it.
Right, which is actually smart politics if what you want to do is gain broader acceptance within the Democratic Party mainstream. Mm-hmm. I don't think it's the correct thing to do morally or on the substance, but politically it's rather shrewd. And maybe Bernie on some level does buy into the Russia narrative. I think he's probably has like competing instincts on it. I'm sure there are elements of it that he's skeptical of. But I just don't think he's viewed as quite as much of an anathema as some of his most diehard supporters, who are always like in a paranoid mindset about him being undermined, currently believe. Again, will there be factions that do seek to undermine him? Yeah. But I feel like his persuasion campaign to make himself more ingratiated with the Democratic Party's structures has again been pretty successful. So I wouldn't be surprised if they waved the white flag, and just allow him to ascend into the nomination relatively quickly.
So a lot of progressive independent media. I don't know how do you characterize yourself? Do you have a political label that you ascribe to?
Not really.
No?
I mean, I've always broadly situated myself on the left, but that can mean a million different things.
Sure, right.
Right.
It's all semantics at some point.
Yeah, and I've always made a conscious effort to write and participate in conservative dialogues. Right? So I write for conservative publications. Right now, I still write for the Spectator magazine, which is like the oldest conservative allied, the oldest magazine in the UK that's allied with the Conservative. I worked for the American Conservative for many years in the US, but also write for left-wing publications and appear on left-wing venues. So,
for the purposes of this question, I'm going to characterize you as progressive.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine.
So I think that there's
I don't even like the word progressive, but I accept it as
it's kind of a blanket term.
Yeah.
But I think that a lot of folks, like you, like Aaron Mate, like Matt Taibbi, Katie Halper, I mean, the list goes on and on, have been very outspoken about what bullshit RussiaGate was, and have really done great analysis on that. And now you have Bernie Sanders, who I think is in some degree, carrying the mantle of that subset of, journalists, independent journalists. Do you think that there's going to be kind of some doublethink going on there when you have Bernie Sanders, who has embraced RussiaGate so wholeheartedly and who hasn't said anything about Julian Assange, where folks like you and me, and again, these kinds of folks are going to have to just, I guess, shut up about that aspect of Bernie Sanders?
Well, I mean, in fairness to Bernie, I think I do recall when Assange was indicted that Bernie did eventually put out a tweet objecting to the nature of the criminal offenses that were alleged on it. I have to double check that. But
I believe it was a retweet of the ACLU, but he didn't actually. His Twitter account didn't refer to Julian Assange by name.
Okay, yeah. Well, whatever the case may be. Is there doublethink going on? Well, for one thing, since I've been in New Hampshire, of course, when you glance at the TV, you're inundated with candidates' TV commercials. And notably, the TV commercials that Tulsi generally runs are anti-war commercials. So that's what she's chosen to spend a fair amount of her campaign budget on, by putting into the airways the New Hampshire anti-war messages that are explicit. And then I saw a Bernie ad. He has a bunch of different ads, but one of them I saw just this morning was like, Donald Trump is the most corrupt president of all time. Okay, I don't know that that's quite true, but I accept that as like reasonable political hyperbole, right?
Sure.
But then the next frame, it showed Trump shaking hands with Putin, and that was supposed to be indicative of Trump's corruption, as if he was corruptly orchestrating with Putin somehow.
Right.
And so that's just your generic, tedious Democratic style talking point. And again, I get the logic of why Bernie would want to employ some of those talking points to broaden his coalition among normie Democrats. But I don't have to like it. I could still object to it. I definitely object to his unwillingness or inability, or however you might characterize it, to challenge any aspect at all of the RussiaGate narrative, even its most egregious excesses. Even if you want to say that, Trump had some shady dealings with Russia, maybe there were some aspects of the Mueller investigation or the impeachment that were warranted. There have been so many just insane histrionics that have been leveled regarding Trump and Russia, whether it pertains to the RussiaGate narrative with Mueller or the current impeachment narrative. And you said that you referred to RussiaGate in the past tense. I don't think it's over. I think that impeachment is just the sort of logical continuation of RussiaGate. They're part of the same narrative continuum. That's why you have Adam Schiff going on the floor of the Senate over the course of this trial and saying that Trump welcomed foreign interference in 2016 and he's trying to welcome it again. So they're using RussiaGate as the basis from which to allege that these supposedly horrendous acts that Trump has committed by mentioning Joe Biden on a phone call and temporarily withholding future dispersal of military aid rise to the level of impeachability. So it's all really one and the same in my mind. And so there might be people in that sort of independent media universe that you talk about that you could like roughly describe as progressive, although again I don't really care for that term that much, who, because they just are broadly on board with the Bernie project of sort of enlivening the working class consciousness and mobilizing new coalitions of voters to challenge entrenched oligarchic interests, whether it be billionaires or corporations that don't pay federal income taxes, what have you. Because that so fits with what their political aspirations are, they're not going to dwell on these issues of relatively lesser importance like RussiaGate or impeachment, even though I find them to be extremely important. And that's part of the reason why I've decided to dedicate a lot of my energy to following Tulsi, who actually does provide an alternate perspective on those things in a way that is really salutary. And so,
So one thing that I've wanted to talk with you about for a while is, if you have some time.
Yeah, let's do like 5 more minutes.
Okay. Is Joe Biden, just because I remember this past summer you had made some statements with, I believe it was along the lines of people were underestimating him, but you've also been critical of him, saying that he lacks mental faculties to really articulate himself, and he seems very confused about his own history regarding the Iraq War.
Yeah.
So could you just maybe provide some light on that? And again, I don't know if maybe your positions have changed since last summer, but do you remember what you meant when you were saying that people may have been underestimating Joe Biden?
Yeah. Well, there was this narrative that said that Joe Biden was going to inevitably collapse shortly after he was running for president because they said that he was too touchy-feely with like women or something. Remember that?
Yep.
Because he had these old statements and votes on racial issues that people were going to find appalling, and they were going to abandon him. You could name the sort of failed criticisms that have been leveled at Biden for now, 9 months, if not more. And so I was saying, in pointing to his resiliency, I was saying it's not going to be any of these relatively minor criticisms that are ever going to take Joe Biden down. If he's going to be taken down, it's going to be of his own doing, because he has to demonstrate that he has the cognitive capacities now to mount a vigorous presidential campaign. And even though the campaign has been very poor, even though his performance has been subpar, to put it mildly, in the debates, at his events, even when I talked to him in New Hampshire a couple months ago, he concocted a brand new story about when he supposedly started opposing the Iraq War. He said he opposed it before it began to me, and which is a total lie.
Right.
I mean, so he just has not performed well, and yet he's still relatively strong in the polls. I'm not saying he's going to win the nomination. I'm not saying that he's necessarily performing in a way that maximally leverages the advantages that he has.
But he's not totally collapsed.
But he hasn't collapsed.
Okay.
I mean, people were saying that Kamala Harris was the front runner because she was going to take the black vote away from Joe Biden. First of all, the black vote is not a monolith. Joe Biden does a lot better among Southern blacks than he does Midwestern or Western blacks. So even referring to the black vote is kind of condescending, because you just pretend that every black voter has the same interest, which is just wrong and insulting. But I think that people were just underestimating the extent to which a lot of voters do still really like Barack Obama. It's funny, when people talk about Biden, the reasons for his resiliency are almost too obvious to discuss. It's almost like not even worth mentioning, so people just kind of gloss over it. Just that he was the vice president for 8 years, a president who was still extremely popular among Democrats, and therefore that's an extraordinarily powerful platform from which to wage a primary campaign. So, I mean, it's not that complicated. I was just saying that people because a lot of people in the media do not like Joe Biden, or at least let's say the online progressive-oriented media, very much hostile to Joe Biden. You don't see a really robust online support base for Joe Biden.
Right.
So the people who exist in that world were trying to come up with all these explanations for why Joe Biden was going to falter, or he would never make it. He was going to drop out before Iowa. I remember a lot of people saying, that hasn't come to fruition. I don't know how he's going to place in Iowa, but he's within the margin of error of victory.
Sure.
So maybe some of that analysis was not totally correct. I mean, I think even if I don't like Joe Biden and I wouldn't want him to be the nominee, I have to separate that analytically from looking at what his political strengths are and why he has the appeal that he does in the electorate. It's important to sort of maintain two modes of sort of analytical approach when you're talking about U.S. politics, because a lot of people can't separate their own personal preferences from their analysis of what's going on, and that sort of creates a muddled picture of what is affecting our political life. And so I always strive to sort of at least do my best to separate out my own personal preferences from a more dispassionate and at least an attempt at impartiality in just trying to coldly assess why a person like Biden would be more formidable than a lot of people in the media who don't like him wanted to admit.
So last question, as you said, I believe that Ukraine-gate and impeachment really was the step after RussiaGate. I think it was a pivot off of what a terrible performance Robert Mueller did. It seemed as though Ukraine-gate was immediately after that, and we've had impeachment.
Literally immediately.
Right.
It was the day after.
So, and now we have impeachment taking place the same week as the State of the Union, which again, I think is going to be hilarious to see these people who are voting to have Trump removed from office literally giving him a standing ovation. We all know that Trump is going to be acquitted. What is the next phase of RussiaGate? Do you think that there will be some other related scandal? Do you think that it's going to be, Russia meddled in the 2020 election or is meddling? Just what do you think is the next phase of this? Because I don't think it's going to go away, right? I think we're in a new neo-McCarthyist era that's going to last for a little while.
For as long as Trump is a public figure, it will not go away. And maybe even after he's a public figure. That's how psychologically ingrained this is in the minds of the people who shape our political dialogue and our political priorities. But they're not just going to abandon it. And that was always the case. I mean, there were some people who have even been on the RussiaGate skeptical camp who insisted to me that once the Mueller report comes out, we're done with this, right?
Right.
And I would have disagreements with them. I would say, no, there's no way. There's no way that you can devote that much energy to this stuff and then just be willing to say, oh, oops, I was wrong. So what form will it take on after the impeachment results in Trump's inevitable acquittal? I think that they're going to take a lot of the information that derived from this impeachment and kind of formulate it into their argument against Trump for re-election. So it's going to enter a campaign phase. They're going to say that how important it is to drive up the margins against Trump because he's going to try to interfere. He's going to try to solicit foreign interference in the election, and therefore we have to do everything humanly possible to make sure that there's no question whatsoever that he lost, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, right? So it's just going to take on an electioneering tenor. And even on a more practical level, they're going to continue there's nothing that prevents the House from continuing more investigations. So there's still some outstanding issues that stem from Mueller, like getting the testimony of Don McGahn, who was one of Trump's lawyers, who they tried to subpoena and contested it, and now it's dragging out in litigation. So they're not going to give that up. I mean, again, as long as they have material to work with on Trump, they're going to work with it.
Sure.
So one thing I've learned over the course of observing RussiaGate now for almost 4 years, this began in the summer of 2016, is that it always takes on different permutations. It never goes away. Yep. Sometimes it ebbs, sometimes it flows. But it's not as if it's within the capacity of anybody who's advocated this now for so long to just do away with it and admit fault. If anything, they double down, which is not a cliche that I enjoy using most of the time, but it does apply to them for just being so steadfast in their utter unwillingness to admit that maybe the premises that underlied this narrative were faulty. They just don't believe it. And so those people have a lot of influence and a lot of political cachet, and they're going to keep it going for as long as Trump is the specter hanging over everything.
And meanwhile, they'll be pushed back against independent media outlets as well by all the Silicon Valley companies under the guise of stopping Russian disinformation. So something to look forward to for us. But regardless, for folks out there who would like to follow you and stay up to date with everything that's going on with you, how can they do that? Yeah,
Twitter, I'm Tracey with an E. You can check out my YouTube where I do, right now, and as I'm in campaign mode, I'm doing like these nightly streams where I just kind of recap everything that I've done or seen or over the course of a day. That's YouTube M Tracey. I do have a podcast that is going. It was on a little bit of a hiatus, but I'm going to be starting that back up.
It was
again.
really a great show. I
Yeah.
honestly really enjoyed your podcast.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. So that's at that's on iTunes, Libsyn, Stitcher, and also, but I'll put that all on YouTube as well. So YouTube is really the place to go. Patreon, you can subscribe to stuff. So it's all out there.
Awesome. Well, Michael Tracey, thank you very much for being on this episode of Primo Nutmeg. I really do appreciate it, and hopefully I'll catch up with you again on the campaign trail.
All right, I enjoyed it.
Thanks.